And at 7:07, I'm Daedalus Howell. We have Assembly Member Marc Levine here. He is representing the 10th District generally, but today specifically for the show. You have a constituency of what, 100,000, 500,000 people?
Almost 500,000 people.
And you're going to speak on their behalf today, all of them simultaneously, a chorus of voices coming through you here now.
They may not agree.
So, what is an Assembly member?
So there are 80 members of the Assembly. We each represent almost 500,000 people.
And this is the state of California.
For the state of California. Yeah. So we all have, there are 80 districts. We represent people, not geography. So that's how we divide up nearly 40 million people into those districts.
Wow.
There's the other house, the Senate. They represent almost 1 million people. So there's 40 of them. And so the 80 of us for our house in the Assembly pass the budget, pass other laws that affect the state of California.
That's huge. That's a big deal, man.
It's for the 7th largest economy in the world to be essentially on the board of directors of that economy, passing all of the laws, making sure the budget is balanced. It is a big responsibility.
And you've had 19 bills that you authored signed into law.
Actually, I've had over 40 bills I've authored.
I was just talking this year.
Yeah, that was just last year, exactly last year.
But that's, forgive me, but you seem rather on the young side, right? The amount of bills you've had passed is exemplary.
So there are different approaches that people take to being a lawmaker.
Okay.
So I'm in Sacramento to advance issues that are very important to the North Bay, to Sonoma, Marin County. How do we make our lives better? And I'm very interested in pushing the levers of government to improve transportation, public schools, our state parks, all of these things that make the quality of life what it is in the North Bay. And so I'm focused on how do we move legislation to do that as a solution to some of the challenges we have. So I'm very focused on that, and also, of course, constituent needs.
Right.
So making sure if a constituent has a problem that we're able to track those things down. Not all lawmakers are focused on doing their job quite that way. There are other ways for them to exert influence on behalf of their constituencies, but I do believe that passing laws is a key way to improve the quality of life.
I would imagine a lot of people in your position are using their place in government as a platform, if not for their own issues, then for their career. Is this the beginning? I know you started in City Council in Santa Fe. That was ostensibly the beginning of your political career. Is being Assembly member a step towards something else?
It used to be by necessity one step, and probably an early step for a lot of people who saw themselves having a long political career. It used to be that you could only serve 6 years in the Assembly. You would be termed out, and then you would perhaps run for the Senate. And sometimes people would be in the Senate first. That would be for 8 years,
Senate.
and then that's right, and then run for the Assembly. Term limits have changed, where now we get to serve 12 years in either the Assembly or the Senate in any combination that we want.
So you'll be 30 by the time.
That's right.
Turn out, yeah.
So I'll be 50 years old when I'm termed out in 2024. But I think that, like most families, it's something that I talk about with my wife all the time. What is the best way for me to spend time in my career that is good for my family, good for my kids, and good of course for my marriage? Mm-hmm. And so we revisit that all the time. And if we think, particularly as a politician, if you start thinking too far ahead, where do I want to be? And if you look at that, almost 10 years out, you start making decisions to get to where you want to be.
Right. But
the decisions that I need to make on a daily basis are more about what's the right policy to solve challenges California is confronting for our local communities, rather than how do I vote on these issues so that I have the support I need to get elected to the next office. And that's a trap that people found themselves in during that term-limited era, where after 3 years, you're already looking for that next office you're going to run for. I have the liberty of not worrying about that.
So you're playing a longer game, but for the sake of your constituents, not for the sake of your career.
That's right. Yeah.
That which is great and generous of you. I think
it's actually incredibly liberating.
Yeah.
Because you get in a trap, particularly for a lot of lawmakers who are brought to the legislature by the status quo to then serve the status quo. And I think we see nationally that there is a lot of concern that the status quo is not serving everyone well.
Right.
And for me, I did not get elected with the status quo bringing me to the legislature. In fact, I ran against the status quo in 2012, was wildly outspent, 5-1, 6-1 by some accounts. So the lens by which I look at issues is not how do I keep my friends on my side. It's much more how do I make sure that I'm serving the constituency that put faith in me when the status quo did not.
Right. And this is a very interesting district. It's very eclectic, it's very diverse, right? One of the things that I thought was really interesting about your particular resume and what you're doing now is that you are on a committee that supports the arts in California.
That's right.
That is, to me, that's a rare phenomena, that there's somebody actually at your level invested in that kind of activity. Why the arts? Do you have a passion for it? Or?
So the arts is incredibly important for culture and society, and that needs to be acknowledged. And it's been underfunded and underinvested. I serve not just on the committee that deals with arts, but also higher education.
Right.
But we also see the lack of investment in arts education in K-12. And so how can we put more investment in arts to help make sure that we have really a balanced society that is informed, and have our culture be informed by the arts, and which is a much more educated culture.
And there's all kinds of things that we can talk about how, the arts improves one's educational experience and creates more dynamic individuals.
I think it's good for civil society.
Certainly, yeah, in identity as a society and regionally, specifically in our case. But I'm always up against how do we justify it?
Yeah.
I mean, and yet it feels so necessary. But why? You know what I mean? I had a guest on, Josh Windmiller, you can see on another show, who's really got a mandate from the Economic Development Board, or Bureau rather, board here in Sonoma County, to push music, right?
Yeah.
And even as articulate and brilliant as he is in terms of why that's important, both of us fumbled for a vocabulary in part to discuss that.
Yeah.
Why the arts? And yet, if we know it's necessary, but we don't know why.
Well, so we see a shift from STEM education, science, technology, math, to STEAM, including A for arts in that type of education, and engineering and math, now engineering, arts and math.
Yeah.
And, as a father, my son's doing guitar, and I see the discipline that is necessary to master an instrument if we're going to look at music in the arts just solely. And then, of course, my younger daughter, my youngest is my daughter, and she wants to drum. So, of course, every parent
doesn't want to
have a drummer,
right.
but they're expressing an interest in this.
Right.
But the arts is much bigger than just music, and we can see how you can develop skills around mastering an art that will really help people, apply themselves throughout life.
I think that's great to look at art as a forum for pursuing mastery of some kind or other, which, of course, has applications across the board,
That's right.
Any aspect of one's life. Why politics for you? What was it that brought you to the juncture back in the day where you made the decision to focus here and give your life to this?
So I was very interested as a child in international issues. I studied national security affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School. I then developed software used to monitor human rights abuses around the world. The State Department funded my work as well as other international funders. And for many years, I traveled over 100,000 miles a year to places like Uzbekistan, Sri Lanka, the Philippines, and Nigeria to do this work, and really had a focus externally from our community on doing good with technology and helping communities. And after my wife and I married and we settled down in the North Bay, I realized that there was a time in my life for that, and that now was the time where I wanted to focus that curiosity and that energy to do good in public service locally.
And it sucks getting shot at, I think.
Actually, I did have people that I worked with in other countries that have been assassinated, and offices that I have visited that had been ransacked and had their computers stolen.
Well, forgive me for being glib. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
But yeah.
And so it was an eye-opening experience for me to deal with that. Perhaps I was a little bit naive getting involved in some of the work that I did, but I also had exit points for things I didn't feel were safe. So the State Department had asked me to do some work in Algeria, and I received a grant to do that work, and I politely said, I don't think that the situation on the ground in Algeria is one that I want to work in, I'd like to retain the grant but apply it elsewhere, and they worked with me on that.
That's great. Yeah.
So I was very appreciative of that. But there was a transition point for me where I wanted to have a focus closer to home and to continue to do good and to serve. And I found that opportunity in my local city council in San Rafael, where I was elected, and then more recently in the state legislature in 2012.
Come back to that in a second. We're talking with Assembly Member Marc Levine. We'll be right back. We're back on 707. We've got Assembly Member Marc Levine with us, and we're talking all things state of California. But your state of California, your state of being in California, began 74. Okay. What was that like? Where did you grow up?
So I was raised in the East Bay.
Okay.
And it was, a wonderful childhood, no complaints, great parents.
Sisters, brothers?
Older sister.
Yeah.
And so it was one of those, textbook childhoods of going to public schools.
What'd your parents do?
My father was essentially a traveling salesman.
Oh, wow.
And my mother, after I started elementary school, worked at Macy's. So I had a retail job.
Yeah.
And so it was a nice middle class existence.
Mm-hmm.
And, had summers in Lake Tahoe, for a week or two.
Yeah.
And, had one summer we had a big trip to Hawaii, which is probably the biggest trip we'd ever gone on as a family.
Nice.
Yeah.
And then college, why the Monterey?
Oh, so my undergraduate was actually
sorry.
at Cal State Northridge,
Okay.
which was a very important time in my life, like anyone who goes to college. It was a very big pool for a kid from the East Bay.
Are we around earthquake time?
Right smack in the middle of the
Yeah.
earthquake. But exposed to so many issues,
Yeah.
like immigration,
Right.
that I hadn't been exposed to before, and then of course the earthquake.
Right.
So met folks who were undocumented for the first time, or that I understood what that really meant for them in their lives, and then of course had the earthquake.
Right.
Had some other issues that came up post, or not post earthquake. Actually, it may have been right around the earthquake, where Louis Farrakhan came to campus.
Oh, wow.
And so as a Jewish student,
Right.
How did that impact me and the community of Jewish students? And that certainly informed.
So we're like mid-90s? That's when he really had a high profile.
Yeah, 92 to 96.
Okay, yeah.
And so I had to deal with the earthquake. I had to deal with those identity issues of, how do you speak for yourself when there's someone coming to campus who says things that's very bad about who you are?
Right.
And then, of course, learning about the immigrant experience here in
Right.
California as well, which has informed me as a lawmaker, because I've done a lot of bills on immigration.
Yeah.
And then perseverance after the earthquake, where I really felt like a pioneer on this campus, where essentially every building was red tagged.
Amazing.
And so you could say that start in politics happened then.
Mm-hmm.
After the earthquake, I ran as a write-in for student body vice president.
How'd you do?
I did great. Yeah. So I actually got into the runoff as a write-in, then was placed on the ballot for the general election, if you will.
Yeah.
And then that next year ran for student body president, which really informed my outlook on budgets and also state politics, because that was my first exposure to the Board of Trustees for the California State University.
At that point, you said no more Farrakhan.
So the issue wasn't not having Farrakhan come to campus.
Right.
It was, should my student fees be used to pay for Farrakhan?
who arguably could be said to have been using hate speech of a sort.
He was using hate speech.
Yeah.
And then you would see other attempts to use student fees. For example, Maya Angelou came to campus, a treasurer,
Right.
which was a wonderful thing, but the people in charge of inviting her decided to hire the Nation of Islam's security force, the Fruit of Islam, to do the security around that event.
That's like having Hells Angels at Altamont.
At Altamont, exactly.
Right.
So, you end up finding out, okay, these are really highly politically charged issues. They become racially charged issues.
Right.
And so how do you deal with that? How do you build bridges? How do you create coalitions of people who want to work to make sure that things like this that are so offensive to who we are and our identity can be resolved in a positive way? And so dealing with Latinos and immigrant issues, dealing with LGBT issues, of course,
Right.
Jewish issues, where we all found a lot of common ground because we all felt that we were
Disenfranchised. a bit.
disenfranchised and
Yeah.
targeted
Mhm.
by the type of hate speech that Farrakhan had been involved with.
Wow. Heady times, the 90s.
I learned so much more about politics being involved in that than I did as a majoring in political science.
And so, service. What compels you? I know at Civics Camp you had some great speakers about the nature of service and what has compelled people to do it. I didn't get the memo in that, forgive my keynote. But what draws you to service? What compels you?
I think that talking a little bit about identity and Jewish identity, that there is certainly a philosophy of social action and repairing the world in my Jewish upbringing that really informs my outlook of how we can, serve everyone and try to make the world a better place for everyone, and that informs my outlook on life.
In terms of your heritage and the obvious hallmarks of history, was that present in your household? The Holocaust and stuff like that? Was that something that was discussed or explored as a family?
So Jewish identity was important, and the synagogue was a central point of my upbringing. And so we certainly had the education about what happened historically to the Jews, and certainly the Holocaust education, which is something that I'm still engaged with, because in the Assembly we have a Holocaust Remembrance Day each year around Yom HaShoah, which is the day that we remember the Holocaust. And each year we in the Assembly bring up a Holocaust survivor or a liberator of the camps, so someone who served in the military to help liberate them, or their descendants. And so we remember the Holocaust that way, and it's incredibly meaningful, not just to Jewish members, but I think for everyone in the legislature who is able to engage their community to bring up a survivor. There are not many of them left. They're very old, they're very frail, and it's a very special day to honor them and also remember the victims of the Holocaust.
Is this what precipitated having a Holocaust survivor on your podcast?
That's right. So I have a podcast, and I had a Holocaust survivor from the North Bay come up. He's in his 90s. And what I focused on the podcast, we know the story of the Holocaust. We know about the persecution. We know that an educated, developed Europe actually herded people into cattle cars and brought them to their death and annihilation. And it's inexcusable and almost hard to imagine that this could occur in the 20th century. But we need to remember that it did, and that this has been repeated. And so in the conversation I had with my Holocaust survivor this year, I really wanted to focus on what happened after the Holocaust. How did he mend his life, have a family, start a business, and not just survive, but thrive in the United States? And it was the first time I had a Holocaust survivor open up to me and talk about how he still goes to therapy, how he still has sleepless nights. But he raised a family. I was just at the school that his grandchildren go to and saw his grandchildren there. They were with me at the podcast, sitting around as we recorded it. And these look like great kids. And to know that he has descendants who are going to have a much better life than he had, but that he was able to pull his life together, but he needed help.
Right, and still needs help.
And still needs help, exactly. At this age, it was very moving to me to have a survivor open up about that experience.
Do you internalize? I mean, obviously you're very empathetic. Do you internalize people's stories like that with your constituency? And if you do, how do you process that and do your job without being overwhelmed? Because there's a lot of stuff happening that's difficult to and for people.
So we've talked about passing over 40 laws that have been signed by Governor Brown, but the most important thing I really do believe is trying to figure out a way to solve a problem a constituent is having. And they can have any number of problems. They might have a hiccup with their unemployment check. They may have tried to log into Covered California to get health insurance, and it's not happening the way that they thought it was going to happen.
Right.
They may have a small business, and the Franchise Tax Board is either holding on to money that they think they're supposed to get back, or is asking them for more money that they didn't think that they owed. They have any number of problems, and they usually call me when they're extraordinarily frustrated. Not at the beginning of this problem, but towards the end when they can't find a resolution to it. And we can really help lives a great deal by resolving these issues for them.
Let's come back to that in a second. We're with Assembly Member Marc Levine, and we're fixing problems. We'll be right back. And we're back at 7:07, and we have Assembly Member Marc Levine with us. So in the last segment, we were talking about how you go to bat for constituents who have problems and all that. Well, maybe I'm wrong or right. Can we just call you up and say, hey, Assembly Member Marc, this thing's happening to me as an individual, can you help me? Or is it broader?
Oh, it's an individual who picks up the phone or emails my office and says, I have a problem, please help me.
How do you make sure they're not like a whack job?
Well, we get all kinds of people calling us with problems.
Yeah.
And we can either help fix this problem or we'll take it as far as we can take it, and sometimes we're not able to get the answer that we want.
Right.
But we can attempt to resolve it. Now, everyone has someone who likes to call up because we're someone that they can talk to, and that's okay. We're there to help. But we have to figure out if it's a problem or
if
not.
It's just a grudge or...
Yeah, and we can figure that out. But most people are calling because they need help.
Right.
And we can go to bat for them. We're an advocate for them.
I mean, is that part of the job, being an advocate for the constituents?
Completely.
Yeah.
And it's at times one of the most frustrating because we want to go to the mat to get the solution that the constituent wants very badly.
Right.
We can't always get it, but we can be an advocate for them to help them get to that resolution, whether it's the one they sought or not, but we can hold their hand the entire way. And it's incredibly meaningful because you can change their life just like that by resolving this problem that's weighing on their mind and that's holding up something that they need in a way that, if we pass legislation, that's a many months long process. The bill goes into law, into effect the following year. That's good too and has a lot of meaning, but for an individual or a family's well-being at that moment, we can help almost immediately.
Is the assumption that when you're dealing with an individual on that sort of micro level, that they represent other individuals who may have the same problem?
So we find out, our bill ideas
Right.
from these things. And so someone will call up with a problem. We find out that this isn't just one person, it's a bigger issue, and we can resolve it. So we had a very large Ponzi scheme here in the North Bay, and many of the victims of the Ponzi scheme reside here. But they had a problem because the company was held responsible for the Ponzi scheme, and there's a victims compensation fund, and they weren't able to get from the victims compensation fund because the individual wasn't held responsible. And we need to make the law different by including, the people responsible as well as the company. And that bill's on the floor of the Assembly. It'll be voted on next week. But that's something that we learned from trying to resolve an issue for a constituent.
Who was the Ponzi scheme? Was it like a city government?
No, not a city government, no.
But speaking of city governments, do you have to intercede sometimes and work with city governments or county governments as a state assembly person?
So oftentimes they raise their issues up to the state legislature, and they'll call me up and say, here are some bills, they're going to affect us negatively, please don't support them. Or this is something that will be helpful for us. Could you introduce legislation to make our lives easier? Sometimes, though, there's mischief at the local level, and there's an opportunity for me to help clear that up as well. And so I will attempt to fix that when constituents raise those issues.
I mean, do you have authority as a lawmaker to come in and say, hey, man, no? I mean,
So there was an issue in the city of San Rafael where they had a home inspection system that didn't serve the homeowners very well.
Okay.
And I told the city that they had this problem. They ignored the issue, admitted that they did these inspections incorrectly.
Yeah, and these are guys you probably know.
I know all of them.
Right, yeah.
And so they said, well, we do some of them incorrectly, but most of them are fine, so it's not really a big deal. So I asked the state auditor to do an audit of San Rafael's inspection program. They found numerous faults. The city is not very happy with me about that, but now they are forced to review their policy, and I think in a way that's going to be beneficial for my constituents and their own constituents as well.
I would imagine that was very satisfying.
Yeah, it was. It would have been much better if when I informed them they had a problem, that they committed to doing something about it.
Versus you having to.
It would have been
elevate
much better.
Yeah. So what's next on the agenda for you? I mean, you're in office for several more years.
Yeah.
Right? What's on your plate in terms of what you're trying to accomplish?
Well, I think the value proposition when I was elected in 2012 was that I was going to really work to make sure that the intended outcomes of our legislation were going to be true to what we said, rather than having unintended consequences.
Okay.
And that when I look at legislation, I'm not looking at a support list or an opposed list and see, well, where are my friends? And I'll just vote that way, but really understand what a bill is trying to do. I think we also have this new era.
Well, let me ask you, I didn't mean to interrupt, but when you refer to friends, of course, that's sort of the general term for those allies you work with. Have you lost friends in that regard with legislation you've helped push through?
Well, I don't know if I would put it that you lost friends. It's a long game. Yeah. So sometimes you're not going to be with people one day, but on another issue, you might be able to be there as well. Yeah. And so you just have to be very mature about it. Sometimes people aren't able to support me on things that I care very much about, but there's always going to be another issue. So if you look at legislation that way, it's really a nonpartisan way to do it. And I think what we've seen also with the new top two primary system, where you have to appeal to everybody if two Democrats are running against each other or two Republicans, that you're really looking for solutions to our problems rather than being in the trench of, this is what the liberal or progressives want, and this is what the Republicans want, and you're always going to just be stuck in those lines. And we've seen in the legislature that we've been able to change that quite a bit. There are Republicans that I'll be able to get some votes on for things I care about that sometimes I'm not able to get some Democrats for. And so that's been very good that we've seen this loosening up with Republicans. And I think that it demonstrates what we're really lacking in Congress, where people are really just dug in. There's no reason to appeal any broader than the narrow segment of voters that will return members of Congress. And you see that also in the national debate, where people want to build walls, they want to ban Muslims from immigrating. They're debating on insults rather than issues that are really important to our country. Where we see at the state level, we're actually trying to deal with healthcare in a constructive way, where Republicans actually voted for a new tax on healthcare systems, healthcare insurance, to fund Medi-Cal. And we were able to find a way to make it revenue neutral with this new tax. We got rid of an old tax as well. But Republicans were part of that. And so we have this near supermajority of Democrats in the state legislature. Democrats are in every state constitutional office. And yet we're finding ways to work together, which hopefully is a lesson that the rest of the country can learn.
Do you have a pipeline to Congress? Do you work with our Congress people?
Well, absolutely. Yeah. So, I've served with members of the legislature who are now in Congress. And of course, my predecessor is now in Congress. And it's dismal looking at Washington thinking that we're going to have solutions to our problems, particularly as we see the way that the debate on national issues has gone. And sometimes I think, well, if only the Democrats were in charge, we'd be in a better place. I don't think it's as simple as that.
Right.
I think that Democrats have to be a bit more magnanimous in their approach, just as I think that Republicans do as well.
What about state succession? That ever come up?
Well, there's the state of Jefferson, and if you ever drive in the parts of those counties that want the state of Jefferson, they actually have trucks with the state of Jefferson logo on their doors, and they wear pins. I actually have a state of Jefferson flag on my desk at the Capitol, and it's a bit of a hoot.
I'm sure. Well, Assembly Member Marc Levine, thanks for coming in.
It's my pleasure.
Come back anytime, I hope.
Thank you.
Okay.